Hello and welcome to No Sweat, where finally we have some footy to talk about. And what a crazy weekend it was. You can follow us at No Sweat Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. And this week, we have a newly restructured team on No Sweat. Unfortunately, due to some budget cuts, we've had to make some changes. And we haven't been able to afford to renew JD's hefty contract. But nonetheless, we push on. As always, my name is Luca and I'm joined by our footy insider at TFNY, top 4 next year. Jim, how are you?
Happy Monday, everyone. The first Monday after footy.
Also with us is Dodd. How are you, mate?
Yeah, good, mate. I don't think it's that unfortunate that JD's off the pod, but, each to their own. But, yeah, great weekend of footy and good to be back with you boys today.
Definitely is. And especially after this week's circumstances, I'm glad he's not here with us, but I'm sure we'll cop an earful all week long anyway. Like we said, footy is back after a long, long time. So we've got a lot to talk about. Let's crack straight into the game, shall we? James, you've got Thursday night.
Yes, and what an incredible game it was. So we have the long-awaited return. We have Richmond versus Collingwood, and it was one of the worst spectacles that you could have returned to football with. Not just by the scoreline, but by the actual gameplay. It just wasn't a great game. It was sloppy. It was all over the place. It was contested, not what a lot of people normally do like when it comes to the Thursday night or the Friday night slot. It actually prompted Eddie Maguire today, this morning, to question whether our iconic Sharon that we all know and love has become too hard and too slippery for players to handle.
Oh,
and he's quoted as saying, "I don't know whether they've put another coat of varnish on the footballs, but no one can seem to grab it." Now, if you look up the definition of clutching at straws, I think that might be one of the first answers you get. Do we think that the balls need to be changed? Just quickly, just a real quick one.
Hard no.
It's very early for Eddie to be complaining, isn't it?
It's so, well, if you look at the traditional fixture, we'll be in about, round 14? So his calendar's in sync. He's just not in fixture. Anyway, we had a great game of footy due to the fact that it was football. Not for the game, but we saw a few things that we could actually pick on, some things that we could actually have a read on, some things we could watch. And what I actually really liked during the game was Darcy Cameron at the start. So he was playing his first game for the Pies. He was actually quite clean. So he was going up against Soldo, who isn't, you wouldn't call him the greatest ruckman, but he held his own. He did a few good things. He was actually quite clean. And talking of the varnish and the footballs, he was actually holding a few marks, which is pretty good. Another bloke that was holding a few marks, which I'm sure a few of you like, and we've all picked up in our super coaches, Jezza Howe. So he has absolutely changed his career ever since coming over from the D's. He was like a struggling forward, but now he's turned everything around and become you'd call him an intercept defender, and he's probably one of the best in the business at the moment, and I'm calling top 3.
Oof.
Yeah, good call on Howard, James. I brought him in this week in Supercoach, which was I'm very happy about that. But I think he's a lock for All Australian at the moment, and it's going to be interesting to see if teams start to tag him because he's just cleaning up down back, taking those intercept marks, coming over, leaving his man, spoiling. He's a great kick, and like you said, he really has turned around his career. I think he's one of Collingwood's most important players.
If you were going to say that he would have a forward tag, so just say this week they've got St Kilda, who would you say from St Kilda could probably play that tag on him well?
That's a tough one. First person that would come to mind is maybe Zach Jones, but he played great in the midfield for him this week. He was one of their best players, as we'll get into later in the round, but he has kind of played that forward lockdown tag before, but yeah, I'm not too sure about that. That's a tough one.
So moving on to the not so good, it's a bit. I'd say it's a bit harsh to be hanging the proverbial all over Marlon Pickett, but he just had no impact. Seemed a bit lost, and it was a bit of a weird contrast when you think about it because he was so influential in a grand final, and then the game against Carlton, which was like 12 weeks ago, he still played his role, and then you got to think like now. He was a bit quiet. So everyone's going to have their down days, rather. So also another not good I didn't like Jordan De Goey on the ball. I know it's been something that they wanted to do a lot more to go to play on the ball. And I just felt like when he was on the ball, he just didn't look comfortable. He was trying to be too explosive and he would run through the packs. And I felt like he was just not very clean at all. I think he's better suited forward.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I'd like De Goey on ball in theory, but I don't know yet. I'm not convinced. And this week, he had 17 possessions and 10 of them were contested, but he only went at 29% efficiency, which, I mean, everyone's hating on Marlon Pickett for going at 42% from 7 touches. De Goey, 29% from 17 touches.
And do you really want De Goey having his lion's share of touches being contested? I thought you would want them not fed to him, but you like him to win his own ball forward and then have the uncontested shot on goal. I think that's where he's better placed. Judging on goals and all that sort of stuff, moving on from that, we're going to go all over to the ARC review. So, new season, still the same debacle, still the same confusion, still the same controversy. It's just gotten to a point where you just need to invest in some better technology. The 2 camera angles they were showing, it just was not good enough. And it doesn't befit what the AFL actually is now. The AFL is such a money maker. It's such an important part of everyone's lives. It makes all this money for a lot of people. When normal, the attendances are high. It would pay to have a normal camera there just to be able to capture these things. I don't know how you boys read it over the weekend, but I noticed that they were saying, why don't they just make the goal line thicker to coincide with the back of the post? They actually brought the post forward and made the goal line thicker.
Moving the line is ridiculous, but I completely agree with your point about the camera quality. And this is a top professional sport in the country. It's the 4th most viewed sport in the world. Surely we can afford a decent camera. And at the very least, surely we can afford to turn up the frame rate a little bit.
The frames are the ball moves about 4 meters every frame. It's like they're running at 12 FPS or something that you'd get on the PS1. It's something that's going to keep happening. The RMITs come in and they've, for lack of a better term, just kept it the same. It doesn't feel like there's any difference.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's the only change, that it says it's sponsored by someone now with RMITs.
With all 3 of us being RMIT alumni, I don't know how well I sit with that. Or how well that sits with me, rather.
Well, considering that I scraped through with a few 50s, I don't think they're offering their best out for general consumption. And moving on to the actual gameplay of the actual game, it just felt very stop-start, as we were saying before. Early on, Collingwood were actually very good. They were waltzing out of defence. I found that they were just chaining handballs, chaining kicks real easy out of defence. They were able to storm forward and just keep that momentum up, and they just looked a lot more cleaner, and they looked like they actually adapted to the conditions a lot earlier, which is quite strange when you think about it, considering that Richmond's game is that scrubby, keep the ball moving type of game. It was a bit out of the ordinary that Richmond didn't adapt earlier, but it was actually, in terms of the result, it wasn't a great result. But in terms of the game, I was welcoming it coming back.
Yeah, good point, James. I think they'd be a bit disappointed they didn't get the win, to be honest. I think they outplayed Richmond, and I think Collingwood would be happy, though, because their forward line was disappointing. Their smalls didn't really play that well. De Goey wasn't great, as mentioned earlier. Jamie Elliott, a few of those guys were pretty quiet. But I think once Cox comes back and Stevenson, their defence is just unreal. Maynard, Crisp, Howe were just moving the ball so cleanly in a wet environment, and they did look really good. And I just want to say quickly, Scott Pendlebury, boys, how old is this bloke? He's almost hit 40. The guy is unreal. He's a class above everyone. I can't believe how good he looked, and he's like a fine wine. He just keeps getting better with age.
So how do we feel about Bruce comparing Pendles to Michael Jordan? I think that's a bit rich, but he is a class above. It's been done to death, and it's been said many times, but he just finds time when there isn't any. He's always got that extra composure. He's always got that extra second in order to keep the ball alive and keep the ball moving.
Yeah, been in quite a lot of comparisons to Michael Jordan over the last few weeks in Australian sports, but we won't be mentioning that too much on the pod, hopefully. But I just thought I was a bit disappointed on Friday, boys. You know, it was still such a tense game. I'm not a Collingwood or a Richmond fan, and I was bloody nervous at the end of that game. And I just think, everyone was jumping on the game and the shortened quarters and lack of skill and all these things. It's Flaming the first game back in 3 months. Look how great the round of footy was. Like, just give it, give it the round at least before we start making all these big calls. I know it was a low scoring game. It was a draw, blah, 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 but I still thought it was great.
No, I couldn't agree more. Thank goodness the rest of the weekend was a little bit more exciting than that Thursday night game. And speaking of, Dodds, you've got Friday night.
Yeah, big game Friday night. Hawthorn-Geelong, one of the best modern day rivalries. And over the last 10 or 15 years, most of these games have been quite close. But this Friday night was quite the opposite. First half was a decent showing and Hawthorn were down by 6 points at halftime. But second half, boys, Geelong kicked 10 of the 11 goals. That's just unreal. You don't really hear of that against a Hawthorn side. And I think in the third quarter alone, Geelong were just smashing Hawthorn in the clearances. They had an extra 31 contested ball possessions in the third quarter. Stanley was great. But I think the star of the night was Gary Ablett, boys. I've loved this bloke forever. And he had 21 touches, kicked 2 goals, looked like he was carrying a little bit of extra weight. But
chunks.
But it did not stop him. He I don't know if you boys saw, but he kicked a goal from outside 50 with a run-up of about 4 meters.
He is so good.
He's a gun. And I think the actual putting on the weight was intentional. He knew that he wasn't going to be playing as much midfield and didn't have to have that bigger tank and sort of keep his frame running around for a lot longer. So he knew he was going to be playing a lot more forward. So having that extra weight, it's marginal anyway, but we all notice it. It might be that he can outmuscle someone a little bit better in the forward line or might have that more explosiveness or that type of quick diagonal lateral movement to get to the ball. I just think it's not unintentional that he's sort of worked on that, but I think it's very intentional.
The bloke could be 200 kilos and he'd still be kicking bags, so can't stop the GOAT. Don't want to overreact too much here, boys, but I think Geelong, out of all the teams in the competition, they've had probably the best, they're probably the team that's going to benefit the most from this new style of footy. We've got shorter quarters, we have less games, and they're playing finally in Geelong for most of their home games, which I know Chris Scott is very happy about. But I just think these bigger midfielders that they have, like Ablett, he's going to mainly be playing forward, but Dangerfield, a few of the other guys, I think this is the year for them to really, if it's not this year, I don't know when it's going to be. And I think they're definitely going to be a top 4 side this year.
It's definitely place for them to have a last crack at it. As you said, like playing games in Geelong would be huge for them. They've got this shorter season. They've got the older squad. If it is ever, it will be this year, and it has to be because they don't really have enough coming through to warrant another top 4 finish or top of the ladder finish. Like you've got Brian Myers who's coming through and kicked 3 goals on the weekend. He played great, but he can't do it alone. You've got a few other pieces, but this is the time.
Yeah, exactly, James. They've got a good mix of those veterans and those younger guys coming through. Like Myers, like you said, he had a great game. I thought Quinton Narkle looked good. He didn't have a lot of it, but just he's electrifying. Every time he touches it, something happens. And Parfitt was the other one as well that looked really good on the weekend. But I just want to say also as well, boys, a lot of controversy around the Burgoyne tackle this week on Dangerfield. And I am a Hawthorn supporter, as the listeners know, but I do think he was very lucky to get off this week. I think the AFL has been a bit soft this week because of his legend, because of his status. He probably got off with a warning, but I think it sends the wrong message towards the sling tackle. It was a dangerous tackle, and I think 1 week would have been fair. What do you boys think about that?
Yeah, I think the AFL have acknowledged that with their actions today. They weren't happy with him not being awarded or him not being suspended as well. And so they've moved very quickly and done something they don't often do this quickly, which is they've already changed the rules about sling tackles. I think that shows that they clearly agree and they don't think that's acceptable either. I don't think we'll see one of those tackles going without a suspension again.
Yeah, and to think that warrants a fine, as Dodd said, it sends the wrong message. So now people, and you've seen recently throughout the news, throughout the last couple of days, Mitch Robinson, he's already fired up saying, "Oh, you can sling people around and just get a fine. Cool, like I'll do that too." It sends the wrong message to the league, and especially when everything that the AFL does is that it wants to protect the head, wants to protect and avoid concussions. It doesn't send the right message. if it's going to be in play where a sling tackle is a reportable offence. That was a textbook sling tackle. The only thing that you didn't see was him being lifted up and dumped, but there was definitely two actions where the ball bobbled out and Burgoyne kept it going. And obviously, for Burgoyne's sake, he was lucky that it was Dangerfield. Imagine if it was like Cam Guthrie or some other young player from Geelong. He would have killed him almost. So it was lucky that it was Dangerfield. But it is a wrong way of going about it where you judge just based off the injury and the outcome. It needs to be based on the action. It can't just be on the injury.
I've been on this boat for years. I agree with that so much. It should definitely be on the action and not about the impact.
Yeah, good points, boys. And I think that, Burgoyne, he's a champion of the game, and we all get that. I don't think he tried to do this on purpose, but just because he is a great bloke and a champion of the game, I think it was weak that they didn't suspend him. If it was Toby Green, he probably would have gotten 2 weeks. So I think a player's reputation as well, even if they've had a clean record, it doesn't outweigh the fact that it was a sling tackle and it was dangerous. So I think the AFL took a wrong stance this week. But moving on, boys.
All right, so moving on to Saturday. This is you, Jim.
Yes, and on Saturday, we were witness to the Cameron and Neil show. So Charlie Cameron, I'm going to make a huge call here, guys. If he isn't already, he's going to be the best small forward in the comp, beating out Toby Green, just in terms of goals output and as a pure forward. And my big call is that he's going to win the Coleman. Already scored 4 this week. I can't see anyone catching him, especially in that Brisbane forward line, where he is, sad to say, but he is one of the only avenues towards goal. You've got Hipwood there, but you can't really set your clock to it. You can't really set your watch to him scoring a goal when he needs to, but Cameron always bobs up and always comes and just gets ready to just destroy anything that comes his way. And we all know how good Neil is. And if he isn't going to be top 5 in the Brownlow, I want to know what's going on, because there's obviously something wrong with the system. And I think it just shows just how important it is to get your trades right. Obviously, that's not a new thing to anyone, but I think that you need to get your trades right. Obviously, Neil and Cameron coming from other clubs, it really obviously improved their team tenfold. So obviously we have the Brisbane Lions. They beat a quick finishing Freo, actually. And I was a bit surprised with Freo at the start. Their pressure was actually non-existent. They did not register a tackle for the first 12 minutes.
Wow.
And it might not be might not have been a sexy game to watch, or it wasn't a showcase game. But if I'm Freo and I'm playing that first game in the hub, I want to make a bit of an impression. I want to make an impression to the rest of the clubs that are in my Queensland hub, that I want to them to know that I'm here for a fight. And them coming and not bringing that pressure and taking 12 minutes for a tackle, it's just not good enough. And they were behind the 8 ball from then. And it just showed that they weren't ready.
Yeah, good point, James. There was an actual bounce as well that Fife and Neil were playing on each other, and the ball went up, and Fife was just being a little bit lazy. There was not much pressure there, and Neil just had a wide open. He just picked up the ball and waltzed forward, and then he ended up getting the ball forward even again because Fife didn't follow him. And we're not having a crack at Fife here. He was unreal this game. But like you said, I think from the get-go they didn't put their mark on the game, and their pressure was non-existent, and that started from Fife all the way down to the rest of the boys.
And to think of Freo as well, they did it in round 1 as well against Essendon, where they didn't really start strong, but they then finished strong. And they did the same in this game, where they tried to finish strong and they tried to make like a gallant comeback at the end. It's just a little bit too little too late. And I think that also comes down to the new coach, where he doesn't have that passion and that drive instilled in the team just yet. And it still takes a while, and it might take him making a few calls throughout the game to actually get them to pull their finger out and go for it. I just think that was a little bit interesting just from Freo's perspective. I know that they don't have the strongest team, but pressure and effort is always free.
Freo are an interesting side. I think they rely too much on their best 2 players, which is Nat Fyfe and Michael Walters, and they were unreal. Both of them. Michael Walters, boys, this guy I think he can be a top 10 AFL player after this season. The guy is in the midfield. He's got a quick step. He's got a clean... The way he just picks up the ball and moves forward, you can't get tackled. He's unreal. And he goes forward. He kicked 2 goals in the last quarter that carried them back in. They had Fyfe playing forward as well. I just think they rely too much on these guys. But it's going to be interesting with Jesse Hogan coming back this week. But I think they do need a tall target up forward because you can't have Walters and Fife just carrying the team. You need them in the middle and in the forward line. But Freo just a bit of a mess at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that forward line of having Lob as the tall target isn't really working as well. Obviously, we've got Hogan on the sidelines. We've got Cam McCarthy on the sidelines still. And they've both got like really unlucky injuries as well. So it's not a slight on Freo's drafting or whatever, but it is unlucky at the moment for their forward line.
Yeah, I think in this game they were a bit stitched up a little bit as well because Sean Darcy in the ruck got injured. So it forced Lob to move into the ruck, which gave them one less target up front. On that point, I think Matty Taberner actually played quite well, but having one contest player forward of the ball probably isn't enough. So I think they'll definitely be hoping they get their big guys back soon.
Yeah, and Taberner was on my list of who to bring up, but I didn't want to bring him up because I just feel like no one knew who he was and no one knows what he looks like. And that's not a slight on him. That's a slight on us for not knowing. But yeah, he played really well and he actually presented and marked everything. I was actually really surprised.
Yeah, one thing about Freo that did impress me in round one against the Bombers and this game as well is their fight. They did mount a few different comebacks throughout the game. They were down early in the first quarter. They were down 3/4 time. So I do think that's a sign of a good side. They're going to be a solid side this year. I think they're going to be in a lot of games, but I don't think they've got those enough A graders for them to win some big games. But they did do well. And I just want to say, boys, for the Lions, I was very impressed with Brandon Starkovich and the fruit, the berry. Took a nice grab at the end. He missed the goal. That would have been all over the news if he took that grab and kicked that goal to seal the win. But the Lions were impressive. And yeah, I just want to shout out those two blokes. They were great.
And well, good on Hutto as well on the call. He was pumping up Tom Berry for that goal so hard and he just let him down. I guess Tom Berry will have to learn from that in his debut. In the end, Brisbane way too strong early and they actually finished well, kicking out to a 12-point win.
And it was a similar story in the next game on Saturday afternoon where Melbourne hung on in what ended up being a nail-biter to beat the Blues by a single point at the end of that game. And my biggest takeaway from this game was very similar to yours on Freo there, James. The Blues need to start better. Similar story to Fremantle. 2 games in a row now that Carlton have started terribly. They were scoreless in the whole first quarter, and they allowed Melbourne to pull out to what was eventually a 42-point lead early in the second quarter. They did turn it around, kicking 7 of the last 8 goals. So eventually they brought the scores level, but it just wasn't enough at that point. It was way too late. And it's a similar story to round 1 where Carlton let Richmond surge ahead. They came back, but ultimately 0 wins from 2 games. It's something that David Teague really has to work on to get these boys firing early. The other thing I think was major in this game is that it was dictated by the ruckman. Early on, Max Gawn was huge in the first quarter. He helped the Ds to 10 of the first 15 clearances, intercepting on the half line, winning everything in the air. But after the slow start, Mark Pittonet really stood up for Carlton, provided a really strong contest around the ground and in the ruck, which then helped the Blues to turn around the clearances. Eventually, Gawn did win the hitouts 34-23, but the Ds only won the clearances by 1. So the big men had a major influence on the momentum of this game and where it was headed.
What was it? What did Pittonet do differently to take the battle to Gawn? Like what was his what did he do after quarter time that actually evened it up?
I think early on he just looked a little bit scared. Gawn really just outmuscled him, won the tap outs cleanly. But after that, Pittonet got stuck in, even not in the ruck contest, but around the ground. He got a few smothers, a few tackles. I think there was 1 or 2 holding the ball free kicks that he won. He just got involved around the ground and really got mixed in. Wasn't scared to get in amongst it and made a big difference in the game, I think.
Yeah. We have to really have a good hard look at Melbourne's forward line. To score 54 points against a Carlton outfit that looked as lethargic and slow as they did in the first half, really, there really has to be some questions asked about Melbourne. And the forward line that they put up in the game, it just, to me, wasn't good enough. So you've got Luke Jackson starting as your full forward. That's not a team who went to Perth and lost in the 2018 prelim. That is the sign of a team who is rebuilding and is bottom 4, realistically. So I just feel like a lot of people have this whole thing about Melbourne where they're going to be coming back this year and going to be a lot better compared to last year. I just don't see it. I just don't see their team being good enough to keep going. And that forward line is just atrocious.
Yeah, James, I agree. And I think Tom McDonald as well, he struggled this week. Jacob Wiedering did a great job on him. He's had two good matchups so far. He's done well for the Blues. But I think what was promising for Melbourne was Christian Petrarca. There's been a lot of talk about him the last 5 years. He's got the potential to be one of the best players in the comp. We just keep waiting for it. And in this game, there was great signs. He kicked 2, had 24 touches, 6 tackles, and it was quite a good performance from him and Clayton Oliver as well. And just also Ed Langdon, boys. Not a lot of talk about that pickup from Freo. I think he's a very underrated player. I think he was underrated in Fremantle. And I think this year as well, he's really going to help the Ds.
Yeah, I had Petrarca to talk about as one of my key points from this game as well. For mine, he was best on ground. He, like you said, had 24 touches, 11 of which were contested, 5 clearances, such an influence on the game, so much so that Carlton ended up moving Ed Kerno onto him for the majority of the game. Although Ed actually played quite a decent game, Petrarca was still influential right towards the end. He kicked Melbourne's only goal of the second half, which was not a good look for Melbourne, but very critical for them. I think he was definitely best on ground and was a key part of this game.
Going back to Langdon, a big slide on his game early was how he uses the ball. They were saying that he couldn't kick, he couldn't do anything with the ball in hand, but he didn't actually play too bad. Like 69% disposal efficiency isn't terrible. It's actually, I think it's almost bang on average. So he's not the worst with the footy. And I think that was a good pickup that they had getting him. And I think they got him quite cheap as well.
And can I just add a quick notable mention here? Congratulations to Harley Bennell. 25 calf injuries, and he's finally made his return to footy now. So well done to him. He only played 50% game time, but he looked quite silky. 14 disposals, very handy game back. On the other end of things, very unlucky to Nick Newman. Second game back. In the first game, he did his elbow and was going to miss a few months of football. Makes it back for round 2. Now he's done his patella and he's gone for the season. So not good news for the Blues there.
Yeah, it looked nasty as well. So, yeah, I hope Newman can come back next year, unfortunately.
Yeah. And last little thing I want to touch on, Sam Walsh had a great year last year. Just lacked a little bit of composure in the end of this game, and he could have helped the Blues get over the line, but made a few big errors in that fourth quarter that maybe show that there's a bit of work left to go. Moving on to Saturday night. Dodd, you've got the first game here.
Yeah, boys, quite a shock. I think definitely the surprise of the round. We had the Suns beating the West Coast Eagles, who are premiership favourites, or if not, definitely up there. And they won by 44 points up at Metricon. I think one of the factors that we didn't think about enough is that Gold Coast, they have been playing in front of not many people for a while. So I think they were pretty composed this week. They're probably used to the quiet sounds. But the talk of the town, boys, has been Matty Rao, hasn't it? And he was just superb. A lot of hype coming into this year. And that's one of the, even though it wasn't a debut performance, it kind of feels like it, doesn't it? Because of this whole coronavirus, we haven't had footy in a few months. And that was one of the best games I've seen a second game player ever play. And he had 26 touches, 7 tackles, a couple of goals, but it's not even the stats. If you just watched him, he had this ferocious attack on the footy and a relentlessness about him that you just don't often see from an 18-year-old kid. And he's just got leadership all over him. He's a big guy already, and I think the players were rallying around him. There's just a lot of energy at Gold Coast at the moment. Obviously, him and Noah Anderson, that's been talked about on this pod as well, that they're pretty good mates and went pick 1 and 2. Noah Anderson was great as well. And Stuart Dew, I think he's got these boys playing with heart, with energy, and it was great to see them get the win Saturday night.
And speaking about Stewie Dew, I think it was a mindset that he instilled in the boys prior to the game that they needed to go hard. They needed to go hard at the footy. They were, at every contest, they were crashing into the West Coast midfielders. Like Stewie was looking not like himself. They were going into Yo. They were aggravating McGovern, and obviously it culminated in him getting suspended and West Coast now contesting the fine at the time of recording. But they just got under their skin. It felt like they niggled them to a way and to a point where they didn't expect it, West Coast. And I think they were a little bit unprepared as well. And they just got under their skin. They were playing hard. And as you said, Rao, he's just a wrecking ball. He was just jumping into everything. He was hitting everyone. He was bouncing off tackles, being contested, getting the ball free. He is something special, and he's a cut above the rest. And I saw a few tweets throughout the game, and it was saying that even 1 was unders for him. That's how good he is.
Yeah, well put, James. He was unreal, and it was just great to see. Like you said, they really took it to West Coast, and that would have caught them by surprise. And it's so great to see that they haven't won a game, feels like in about 8 years, to get the win. And if you boys want to see something funny, try and look up the boys singing the song after the game. There were quite a few lads in there that had no idea what words were to be sung there. They were in real strife. But are we a little bit worried about West Coast after one game? Should we overreact at all, or was it just that the Suns really maybe surprised them and just took it to them more than they expected?
Well, the Suns finished this game with 20 more contested possessions than West Coast, which is not something that we've seen often in the past, especially without David Swallow. I don't know whether we should be worried about West Coast in the long term, but there definitely need to be a serious review done about this game. They couldn't get the ball to their forwards. They couldn't win the footy in the midfield. There are some questions that definitely need to be asked. If they don't fix them soon, they might not be as good as we thought they would be this year.
And with the Suns, boys, I know in our predictions podcast last week, we were a little bit stiff on them probably. We only gave them the one win for the season. But after this week's performance, what do you think, realistically, how many wins do you think they can get in the next 16 games? What would be a fair margin for them this year now?
I'm assuming you mean 15 games left. So we're going to go and say that they're 1-1 already. I can see them winning another 3 or 4.
They've got Adelaide this week.
Yeah, well, you sort of would almost lock them in for that one.
Yeah, I was just testing your maths there, James. We had a lot of good feedback last week that you were good with the percentages and the numbers. So. But yeah, Adelaide this week, they'd probably be favourites, I'd say, after Adelaide's dismal performance. But do you know if they are or not? Or
yeah, they are.
Yeah. Oh, they are. That's great. Adelaide are a bit of a shambles at the moment, but yeah, I'd say 4 or 5 more wins for the year would be great. And it is good to see the Suns get a win, isn't it? I think that's probably the feel-good story of the week.
And you just touched on Adelaide. Well, we'll move into that now because also on Saturday night, they got absolutely smashed by the prison bar wearing Port Adelaide side. It was Adelaide's lowest ever scoring game at Adelaide Oval and their biggest ever defeat in a showdown game. So huge for them, and it shows exactly how bad they were.
Just before we get into the actual synopsis of the game, how good was it to see fans at the footy? So there was 2,000 there. How good?
That was my number one thing to talk about in this game. As good as Port were, the crowd at the footy was so encouraging to see. Although there were only 2,000 fans, like you said, 400 Adelaide fans, 1,500 Port fans-ish. You could hear them, I think. And it was really good to see that we might be headed in a direction where we can get back at the ground pretty soon. But my other key takeaway from this game is that it was way too easy for Port. The first quarter was a little bit balanced, but after that, Adelaide did not put up a fight at all, especially in the midfield. There was no pressure around the ball from the Crows. Port moved the ball so easily out of defence. Players like Darcy Byrne-Jones, the Cannon, Trent McKenzie, Carl Amon, they were racking up all these disposals on the wing out of half-back, working it forward with absolutely no opposition. It was a walk in the park for Port.
It was too easy for Port, but boys, I don't know about you guys, but I'm actually quite high on the Power this year. I was bullish at the start of the year. I think I had them around the 7 to 12 mark, but I know it's only been 2 games, but there's this watching this game, even though Adelaide, are probably not going to be a great side at all. There was something exciting in the air. And I think Dersma, the 3 lads, Dersma, Connor Rozee, who will be talked about a lot this year, and Zach Butters, they had this swagger about them during the game. I hate using that term, but when they were kicking goals, they were celebrating. I know Connor Rozee smothered one of the Adelaide boys and then got stuck into him a bit, giving him a little bit of a lip. And I just think Port this year, they have that good mix of young talent coming through like these blokes. You still got your Travis Boakes, your Stephen Motlops, your Tom Rockcliffs, the greatest player of all time, the Hoff. We haven't heard his name in a while, but I'm actually quite high on Port this year, boys. What do you think?
Yeah, and you said about the goals as well. I'm not sure if you saw, but Butters' goal where he flushed it soccer from 30 out, about half post high, that was a thing of beauty. And it actually featured as a highlight on TFMY.
Cheeky plug there. Now, I agree. These boys are so exciting. And as much as they were spoken about last year, they lived up to it this week. Rozee spent most of the game in the midfield, which we didn't get to see much of last year. Although he only had 17 touches, he finished with a game-high 8 clearances. Every time he was around the ball, he was involved, he was dangerous, he was doing something. Like you mentioned, Dersma kicked 3 goals, looked really good. Butters had 8 tackles, 21 possessions. So there's good signs all around for these young boys. But it doesn't stop there. Another one that played really well this week that was also key to this game, I think, was Todd Marshall, where Port's tall players made a huge difference. Marshall was hyper competitive, kicked 2 goals. Lysette had 32 hitouts, playing really well against Riley O'Brien, who didn't have a bad game either, but Lysette played well. Charlie Dixon forward was a menace, kicked 3 goals, as did Justin Westhoff. So these big players really took the game on for Port.
And the opposite of that was the Adelaide forwards. They didn't look great, did they? And there's been a lot of talk about Tex Walker. I know our mate Kane Corns got stuck into him a bit on the Sunday Footy show because he looks like he's carrying a little bit of weight, and he slowly digressed as a player the last few years, hasn't he? And he was very quiet Saturday night, and I'm worried about Tex and the Crows. I don't know about you boys, but I think are they the new favourites for the Wooden Spoon?
They're definitely in the mix, but going back to their forward line, Luca's boy, Darcy Fogarty, he had his shirt ripped off about 93 times. How did you find his game, Luke?
Look, he wasn't amazing, but he definitely got amongst it more than a lot of the Adelaide players did in their forward line. He kicked a goal early on, was competitive, but it wasn't enough, really. And to make matters worse for Adelaide, Rory Sloane came off injured. They iced up his quad during the game. Losing their captain when their midfield's already in a struggling point, not a good sign. Jake Kelly got concussed in the second quarter as well. So 2 of their more reliable pieces gone. And a quick mention as well to Travis Boak, who won the showdown medal with 24 touches, kicked 1 goal, 1. And Stevie Motlop looked really exciting, took a great grab. I don't know if you guys saw that, but one of the early contenders for better marks of the year, maybe not the mark of the year, but it was good, and kicked 2 goals as well.
I think Butters was really robbed for not getting best on. I feel like he was a little bit better than Boak just around the footy as well. And his goal sense, it's always there. He's just like a little bit electrifying. Dersma, and I know we've spoken about them earlier, but Dersma, Rosie, and Butters, they just have that. They have that sort of competitive edge and electricity that they just bring energy to the forward line and to the midfield. I'm actually thinking good things as well for Port. I didn't really have them even close to my top 8 at the start of the year. I still think they're just sitting outside, but they are going to be scary good in a few years.
Yeah, their percentage is probably the highest I've ever seen as well. So they're well placed after 2 weeks in a shortened season. So it's going to be interesting to see how they back it up in the next few weeks.
All right, well, that's Saturday done. On to Sunday, and with the early game is Dodd.
Yeah, another upset, boys. We had the Kangaroos, along with Essendon, as we'll talk about shortly, both flying up to Sydney for the games. We had the Giants versus North, and the Kangas with a surprise win by 20 points. And I know here on the No Sweat podcast, we had the Giants going undefeated. So, yeah, that's the old No Sweat podcast curse already. It's impacted the Giants. It's its first victim. But the North team were very impressive, boys. And North don't have the most talented list, for sure. We can all agree on that. But they play well together. They play hard. They're well coached. And I just want to quickly mention a few boys that really impressed me this week. Cameron Zurhaar, boys. I don't know if you saw him, but he might not have the stats. He did kick 3 goals, but he only had about 10 or 11 disposals, I think. But he's just got that it factor. He's smart. He's craft around goal. He's just exciting to watch. And him playing alongside Ben Brown. Actually, I know we've mentioned Nick Larkey a lot on this podcast as well, but their forward line is getting quite dangerous, I think. And also Sean Higgins, boys. How about this? We had Matty De Boer. He doesn't mind tagging a few of the best players in the comp. And he held Cunnington to 1 disposal at quarter time. But they switched him on to Sean Higgins in the second quarter. Listen to these stats, lads. Sean Higgins in the second quarter, with De Boer tagged him, had 13 touches, 4 clearances, and 3 tackles just in that quarter. It's quite impressive. And Sean Higgins, there's been a lot of debate about him for about 10 years now. We thought maybe he could be one of the best players in the competition. We know he's been riddled with injuries throughout his career, but I think as well, these shortened quarters, shortened season, this could be big for Sean Higgins. And I think he's North's best player when he's up and about. But yeah, very impressive win by the Kangaroos. But boys, what do you think? Does this game tell us more about the Kangaroos and their performance? or is it a bit more telling of the Giants and their performance this week?
I think it says a bit more about North. I think it says more about their competitiveness, that they're ready to have a fight. I think with Reece Shaw now at the helm, and we have never heard a bad word about Reece Shaw and his coaching abilities, which is a bit strange actually. He's been very sort of instrumental in sort of instilling a North Melbourne attitude on them. And that might sound a bit ridiculous or might sound stupid, but he's actually instilling that shinboner spirit, I think you could say. I don't think it says as much about GWS. They're just as good. It's just a blip on the radar for them. I think they'll be back better than ever. And if I have a look at who they are versing this week, they've got the Bulldogs. So they have someone who is also on the downturn and they need to, again, prove themselves. So that's going to be a great match. Obviously, we know GWS versus Bulldogs, always great matches. But I think, yeah, definitely says more about North.
Yeah, I agree. I think Reece Shaw's scheming and game plans have been really good so far in what he's shown us. I'm excited to see what they can do for the rest of the season. A little bit more competitiveness like this from North, and they could be a really exciting side. Also, just a quick point out, shout out to Todd Goldstein, absolutely dominated Sam Jacobs in this game. 51 hit outs. North won the clearances pretty comfortably. Another big factor.
I think the most impressive thing for me, boys, is North kicked 12 goals and Ben Brown only had one of them. So we know in recent years, Ben Brown has been dragging 2 or 3 defenders in some quarters along with him because they just had no one else to take the pressure off him. But they were very well balanced yesterday. They played hard, as we've discussed, adding a little bit of class. We know Polek was scrutinised quite heavily with his hefty contract, but he was great yesterday. And Pittard as well, Jasper Pittard, 2 former Port lads, both played quite well. And I'm actually quite high on North lads. I didn't think I'd ever say this, but I think they're a lock for the top 8. It's a big call, but I'm going early here.
Huge call.
Well, we had them at 9th in the no sweat predictions, so they'll be around the mark. It's
nice to see that Dodd's holding JD's mantle while he's MIA for this week.
Yeah, he paid me a solid amount. I'm not going to name how much, but to pump up North this week. So,
talking about their avenues to goal, so you're talking about Brett Brown only had 1. It is encouraging to see Zerha kicking 3, Thomas kicking 2. It just shows that they've got obviously more than one avenue. And I completely agree with Zerha. The Bull, great man. He's going to become really interesting to watch. And his career is actually quite interesting to see how it will play out. He's been compared to Dermot Brereton today, a young Dermy. So we'll see how he goes. Yeah.
Zerha is an absolute excitement machine. I don't know about the Dermot Brereton comparisons though.
Well, you might have to blame your great man, JB. He offered up the comparison.
Yeah, very impressive win by the Kangaroos, and it set the tone for quite a good day for the Melbourne clubs up in Sydney. And our next game, we have the Swans versus the Bombers with a very happy James recapping this game.
Yes, this one is the Battle of Joe Danaher's signature. I'm not sure that's quite valuable anymore considering his injury, but I digress anyway. It was a weird game again. It was a weird round. The games I was covering, boundary side, I was boundary right, obviously, for this one and for the Collingwood-Richmond one. It was just a weird feel. Like Essendon were kicked ahead, then Sydney would come back, and then Essendon would kick ahead again, and then Sydney would come back. It obviously was a bit of a back and forth. An interesting stat I rustled up throughout the day today is that Essendon, and I'm not going to include Collingwood because they ended on a draw. So despite their 2 close wins coming up by only a goal apiece, they're the only team to currently not trail at any point in a match this season. 2 wins, 2 6-point victories. It sort of paints a picture that they're starting strong, they're playing strong, but then they're finishing weak. They're not keeping that flow going throughout the whole game. And this is evident in this game as well. Yes, last year was the opposite. Essendon would come out slow and then finish strong. Now they're coming out strong and finishing slow. So you just really want to see sort of a more consistent approach from Essendon. You want to see that 4 quarters being played. It was very free-flowing at the start, but it tightened right up. Sydney played their real Sydney type of game, and it just ended up being real sloppy and real contested, and it was just real fumbly. If you were going to showcase a game in Sydney, it wouldn't be that one. You wouldn't be showing that game because it was ugly. It was an ugly game. And Essendon's inside entries into inside 50 was absolutely terrible. I don't know how long the Dons can keep thinking that kicking it on Tipper's head is going to be a good entry to 50, to the forward line. I'm not sure if you boys actually watched the game or not, or if you've seen prior, but it's like a get out of jail free card back into jail that they're using. It's like something they use that they think will get them out of jail because he's quick, athletic, agile. But if you're going to do that, why would you kick it on top of his head when he's got someone? He will never really outmark someone. He's good when the ball hits the deck, not good when the ball's in the air.
Yeah, and he only took one mark for the whole game. So it shows that may not be a great strategy. The Bombers did end up taking 7 marks inside 50, but maybe they do need to redirect the eyes a little bit and lower the eyes.
I think the marks inside 50, I don't have the stats in front of me, but I know that McKernan was quite strong inside 50. So he was able to clunk a few and take those like really important marks. And he actually kicked well, which is obviously a bonus. He's actually improved a lot recently, and another player that's improved a lot, and I know that Dodd wants to have a bit of a piece of him. Andrew McGrath is developing quietly into a class player. I think he started really strong and carried that number 1 pick moniker around with him. He carried it around pretty well. There wasn't really many people to think, he was a bust or he was not as good as what he should have been, all that sort of stuff. He's been like progressively getting slowly better. And I think he's becoming that midfielder that Essendon really need, that in and under midfielder where they're coming in and he's just showing a lot more every single week.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought him up, James. And in the game, he was the standout for me. And like you said, he had a great rookie year. He averaged 20 disposals in his rookie year. But because of that great rookie year, the next 2 years were kind of a little bit underwhelming, I think. He still averaged 20 touches a game, slowly increased his goals as well. He only kicked 1 goal in his rookie season. I think he kicked 10 last year. But yesterday he had 25 touches, I think, and 8 tackles. And he was great. That was great to see. I think if he plays more in the midfield, attacks the scoreboard a bit more, he's just going to keep improving. And I think this is the year for him. He's been in the league 3 years now. He's had 3 years under his belt. It's been very consistent, like you mentioned. But where do you think, honestly, do you think this year he'll be a set midfielder, or will he still play off the halfback flank a fair bit?
Well, first of all, I just want to say the words that you use there, underwhelming, that's definitely the perfect word to use. So, and I'm deviating slightly away from your point, but I'm hoping that's not where Sam Walsh ends up. I'm hoping that because his first season was so good, we don't really want to keep seeing that increase in output for him. So I hope we don't find that we're finding that Sam Walsh is too underwhelming. To answer your point about McGrath, I think he should be a midfielder. I think he should be in the guts. And I think he should be taking the spot of Heppel eventually, if not sooner rather than later. Heppel's just too slow. He's not cut out to being that elite player that everyone thought he was going to be. Could also think that a wing might suit McGrath a bit more. So obviously he came from a athletics background. And I think he could replace Zaharakis, who has been playing on the wing as well recently. He's just been absolutely, I don't want to say terrible because that's a bit harsh, but he's been real down on his form. I think the game's gone past him. He's a bit too slow, and I just find that he's not ready, and I think he's past his time. He's not ready for AFL football anymore.
Yeah, I agree with your point, James, about McGrath spending more time in the middle, and he's the future of the Bombers. Him, Zach Merritt and Dylan Shield. I think this year's the year to experiment them playing more together as a body in the midfield. And I think that's promising signs. And I think the Bombers have a lot to look forward to this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's quite fitting ending the recap of the game. It's quite fitting that the same goalpost that was the downfall for Essendon last year with old mate Dane Rampy jumping up and doing his best stripper impersonation was the same. It was the same post that Blakey hit and gave them behind to be 6 points down. So it's a bit of revenge.
I think you've come up with a great idea for me there, James. I think when Dean Rampy retires, get Rampy's big lid, attach Fleeman 12 GoPros to his head, let him climb any AFL pole he wants, and he can be our replay. We don't need ARC anymore. Sponsored by RMIT. Let's give it to Dean Rampy. What do you reckon, boys, about that? Should I give Gil a call?
Yeah, go for it, though. That sounds fantastic.
On to another really interesting game, the last game of the round. St Kilda hosting the Dogs at Marvel Stadium. And the Saints got a really good win in this game, which was pretty entertaining, to be honest. My biggest takeaway from this, the ball use from St Kilda was exceptional. The class they showed throughout this whole game, by foot especially, was incredibly exciting. They finished the game with 60 more kicks than the Dogs, and they really made them count with some beautiful switches of play, some swift attacking movement. I think it's a clear insight onto what Brett Radham wants to do with the Saints and his game plans. And it goes hand in hand where a few years ago they drafted great kicks of the football specifically. And now it's really paying off and showing. And that drafting goes hand in hand with my next point, which is about their recruiting. Because in this game, the Saints' recruitment really paid off. They went hard this offseason bringing in recruits, but today they were all fantastic. Dougal Howard defended really, really well. Paddy Ryder played in tandem with Rowan Marshall in the ruck and was really competitive. Bradley Hill was useful on the wing, but the best two for me were probably two of the Saints' best players in this game. Dan Butler was super dynamic, really exciting, kicked 2 goals, 1, was involved every time he was near the football. So that's a really good pickup from Richmond. But the one that I thought was the best on ground was Zach Jones, who we mentioned him earlier. He was incredible in the midfield in this game. 29 touches, 13 of them contested, game high 6 clearances, pretty much unstoppable for the Saints.
What was it about Jones's game that actually reflected in the scoreboard?
He was really hard at the footy, kept winning the ball, and he used it quite well. So he went at 75%. The Saints' kicking was really good, but especially from their midfielders, to a point where the Doggies' midfielders went missing effectively. Now, we've talked up the Bulldogs for the past few years about their exciting young midfield, but they were not good at all in this game. Obviously, Lockie Hunter was out. Bont was expected to take a big step up this year with the captaincy, but he kicked the ball really badly and he was pretty quiet.
Do we find that the captaincy is hindering Bont, or is it too early to tell?
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about the Bont the last 2 weeks, and it's a lot of responsibility at his age to be captain. And he's a great player, as we've all mentioned previously, but I think it's a little bit too early to know. I think the Bont's been heavily targeted, especially against Collingwood round 1. They stuck into him quite a bit, and this game as well. But I think time will tell. But the one for me that was disappointing, and I don't know what the go is. I think he only attended 7 centre bounces throughout the whole game, is Jack McRae. And he's the one. He takes a lot of pressure off the Bont. Him and Dunkley. Dunkley was great this game, but there's something in the air about the Doggies. I don't know what it is, but something not right there.
So do we find that, again, the similar question to what we asked about GWS and North, do we find that this game tells us more about the Saints, or does it tell us more about the Doggies?
No, I think this is definitely a sign of the Saints being really good and matching up well. Like we said, the Doggies' midfield was quiet, but I think theirs were just individual mistakes in this game as opposed to a game overall team situation. The Saints for mine set up really well, though, and they pressured the Doggies so much. But like you said, Dodd, there were a few good players for the Dogs. Josh Dunkley was really good. Bailey Smith was fantastic. And maybe that's a reason why McRae spending less time in the midfield, allowing Smith to move in. Someone like Patrick Lipinski as well, spent a bit more time in the midfield. Smith was fantastic. 29 disposals, 15 of them contested. Either way, I think you look at this game and it says more about St Kilda than anyone. They were so good. You could name probably 7 to 8 players in the contention for best on ground. Jack Billings kicked 3 goals. Jim's man, Mill Park man, Jade Gresham played really well, 25 touches, 14 contested. Jaron Geary forward tagged on Johannesson, something that we haven't seen for a while, but did a great job in that as well, shut down Johannesson. Negative news for Saints on that one is that he's gone in for scans today. We haven't got results yet on Geary, but he played a really good game, and the Saints overall surprised me. I was so wrong on them this week. I thought they would be struggling and slow coming out of lockdown, but they looked really, really sharp overall.
A lot of talk about the Saints off-season strategy in previous years. We know they've traded quite a few first and second round picks. A lot of recruiting. They've picked up Brad Hill. They got Zach Jones as well. Hanbury, we know, came last year. And there's one that's gone slightly under the radar, Dan Butler from the Tigers. And I heard Terry Wallace on SEN this morning. He actually reckons, he thought this at the time and he still thinks it, he thinks Dan Butler was the best small forward at Richmond. So better than Castagna, better than Rioli, better than a few of the other guys. And I thought he was great. He kicked 2 goals, had 14 touches, but 6 tackles. He had that pressure, that manic pressure up forward. And that's what you want from your small forward. 6 tackles inside 50. That's a great result. And the Saints, like we mentioned it earlier with Stuart Dew and the Suns, I think Brett Ratton just brings culture to the Saints, and the blokes love him. They love playing for him. It was great to see him after the game. He looked up and about in the press conference afterwards, and he's such a great guy. And I think the Saints this year, they could be a really interesting team to keep an eye on.
So, yeah, I agree. I think the Saints could really be dangerous if they can keep this form up. They were really good to watch this week. But looking ahead to next week, round 3, we'll bang through the games quickly. Thursday night football at the MCG, except with no crowd. Richmond against Hawthorn. On Friday night, we've got the Doggies and GWS. Saturday, we've got North versus Sydney, Collingwood versus St Kilda, and Geelong versus Carlton, and Brisbane versus West Coast. And then on Sunday, Gold Coast versus Adelaide, Essendon versus Melbourne, and Freo versus Port. What are you boys looking forward to? Are there any games here that really take your eye?
Yeah, Brisbane versus West Coast, I'm actually really looking forward to. I would love to see how West Coast respond. Obviously, being embarrassed by the Suns, I'm looking forward to how they can get back at Brisbane. And Brisbane coming off a narrow win, they're going to want to keep their momentum flowing. So I think that's a real good game for Saturday night.
Yeah, I agree, James. And the other game that's caught my eye is the Friday night footy. We got the Western Bulldogs and the GWS Giants. I'm interested to see how the Giants respond as well, but more so the Doggies. They've been I think the most disappointing team so far. Round 1, a lot of hype. They were actually favourites to beat Collingwood in round 1. They got done by 60 points. We just mentioned now against the Saints, disappointing loss. So they don't want to start 0-3. They'll want to come out and get this win against the Giants. So I'm really looking forward to this game.
Yeah, and the whole backstory behind what happened last year, where the Giants bullied the Dogs again. This would be a really good match for the Dogs to come out and protect and but they will help Bontempelli be as strong as they could. They can't let him get beaten up, and it's a really good game and a really good opportunity for him to come out with authority as the captain and just take his team under his wing and just all of them ride together. They need to be accountable for each other first, and they need to just perform.
And I think before this week, we looked at the matchups and we thought there might have been a few easy wins here and there. And it proved to be a really interesting week of football with a lot of unpredictable games. So hopefully that continues next week, because you might look at it and think that there are a few easy games. But if what we saw this week continues and teams really perform better than we expect, it might be one of the more even seasons we've seen in a long time, particularly with only the 1 matchups against each club as well.
Yeah, I agree, Luke. I was very high on this season before the whole COVID stuff, and even this has thrown another spanner in the works. I think this year is wide open. There's about 4 to 6 teams at the top that could win it all, but then from 6 to 14, it's wide open, and it's so great to see upsets, and hopefully we see a few more this week.
And with that said, it's time for Australia's favourite trivia segment, Footy IQ. If you haven't heard this before, the boys go one at a time to list the answers to a question or a prompt until they're all named. But if you get one wrong, you will hear an and you're out. Today, obviously, JD's not here, so the boys are going head-to-head for the first time. And in a tip of the cap to Matty Rao's dominant performance this week, we're going to look back at the past 10 Rising Star winners. So from 2010 onwards. Starting with you, James.
Let's go with the obvious, Sam Walsh.
Correct. Last year. Todd?
I'm going to go Andrew McGrath.
He's correct. 2017.
Let's go someone who didn't live up to their potential. I'm going to go Louis Taylor or Squeezy Taylor, depending on how you look at it.
Correct. He kicked 3 goals this week, mate. I think he would be unhappy with your not living up to potential comments.
I'm in strife already here, boys. Far out. I'm going to go Jacob Wiedering. Thought so.
Nice and early, Dodsy. James, can you claim the win here, mate? There are 7 names out of 10 still on the board.
I'm not too sure if he debuted earlier or not. Let's go with Daniel Rich.
That was a little bit earlier. I think that was 2009. So you've just missed out on that one. Dodds, you're back in, mate. You got a lifeline. Boys, I only gave you 10 names and there's 7 still on the board. Come on, lads.
Oh man, this is bad. I'm not confident about this one again, but let's go David Swallow.
Also
back
incorrect. We're in strife here. James.
Wow.
So this is for the victory, is it?
Come on, James.
I'm pretty sure he was in 2011. I'm going to go Dyson Hebel.
That is correct.
Yeah, nice.
Ding, 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 ding. Wow. I don't know what to say about that.
Bang! Insert the sound effects.
James has his first win on the board.
Jimbo with the win.
The monkey's off the back.
And with an Essendon player as well.
Dodd, there is a Hawthorn player, a current Hawthorn player on the list as well in 2013. Can you think of who that is?
Jordan Lewis. Who knows?
Jager O'Meara, Doddsy. Jager
True,
O'Meara
true.
won at Gold Coast in 2013. Before that, we had Dan Hanbury in 2010, Daniel Talia in Adelaide 2012,
Oh, geez.
2015, Jesse Hogan, 2016, Callum Mills, and 2018, Jaden Stevenson.
Wow.
You wouldn't say that any of those are top tier talent. I think it might be more of a curse rather than a blessing to win the
Yeah.
Rising Star. Yeah, shout out Callum Mills, you know.
Jager O'Meara might have a word or two to say about that.
Oh, if he could stay on for three consecutive games, I reckon he'd have your back. But yeah, he just goes and fractures his face. But yep, that's all good.
All right, and with that over, that's us for another week. As always, thank you for joining. We'll be back next week with the stories from round 3. As always, you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at No Sweat Podcast. You can follow me at Luca on Sport. You can follow Jim's work at Top 4 next year. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Dodd. We've been No Sweat. We'll see you next week.